The problem with the narcissists like Donald Trump is that they only see themselves. The world is a mirror. To a true Renaissance humanist, the world is a window. It's a glass. And you look out and see others. You are curious about them.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Ken Bartlett, Professor of History and Renaissance Studies at the University of Toronto. Ken helped establish the Renaissance History program there 40 years ago, and since then he has built an extraordinary career as an educator, thinker, author, and communicator of history. I recommend that you simply Google Kenneth Bartlett to find not just his articles, his books and accolades, but his video and television series about the Renaissance, travel, about Europe and history. He is a consummate disentangler and demystifier, and this is evident in our conversation today. We discuss 4 key areas: the idea and the need for mediation in our ever-accelerating world, the Renaissance itself, the idea of the Renaissance human, and of course Donald Trump, and the evolution of education. There are a number of great themes in here that are worth elaboration, and I encourage you to dig in, to have your own conversations, and to send me your feedback. You can go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca, to download this episode or any other, and to find ways to get in touch with me. Send me your thoughts as well as suggestions for future guests, and if you like this show, please give it a rating on iTunes or whatever podcast app that you use. Ken Bartlett, welcome to the program.
Pleasure to be here.
I'm really excited to have you here on this program here in Toronto at the University of Toronto, Victoria College. By the way, we're in your office, and it's not only a beautiful office, but a beautiful building. I'm quite inspired, and I imagine you are too, to work here.
It's terrific. The building was built in 1892, and this is one of the original offices, one of the very few that hasn't been changed. And it's a corner office, which is not just a sign of success. It's actually a sign of getting light from 2 sides.
The one thing I like about this office is that it's surrounded by books, so you're speaking my language already, and some of them are so high that you can't reach for them, so that's always a good thing.
Well, you don't necessarily have to read them. Academics learn by osmosis. We simply feel the contents through the spine.
Do you ever have to put them on your head and just let them seep into your brain?
No, not at all. You just have to leave them there. In fact, it's better if you leave them there because they begin to intellectually gestate with their fellows.
Start making new books, synthesis by themselves. So you're a historian focused on Renaissance history, and that's definitely an area that I want to dig into in just a little bit. But before we do, the first question is always the same, and it's a deliberately broad question to get a deliberately broad response. So Ken, what on earth is going on?
Well, it's exactly the kind of question that I deal with daily, because although I'm a Renaissance historian, I see myself more broadly as an historian of culture. What role does culture play in the development of a civilization or society? And today, in our current world, it's an extraordinarily important question because circumstances are changing so rapidly that we have to develop new instruments, new vehicles, new techniques in order to not only redefine culture, but to see how culture actually interacts with society in general. So, for example, think of the internet. It's now reached a birthday. Tim Berners is celebrating his birthday yesterday, I believe, which is a great thing for him to do. But at the same time, it has produced an enormous amount of information. And that is information that has passed from one individual or one group to another, but not really through the mind of an editor, not through someone who, in fact, can determine either its value or even to an extent its correctness. It's like the gene pool, the only pool where there is no lifeguard. It's a pool of ideas that very often is simply out there and it forces the individual then to come to terms with that information. And this in many ways is wonderful. For example, because I deal with images a great deal, there now are images available that when I was an undergraduate were only really easily accessible in black and white photographs. Now they are available in wonderful 2400 dots per inch reproduction with terrific color separation. You can almost see the brushstrokes. This is simply marvelous and great. But what does that actually mean? You've got the image available, but how do you actually interpret that image so that it has some meaning both to you as an observer and to the society in which you live? So what is going on today? Essentially, individuals and groups, entire academic disciplines, and I think society in general, are beginning to face the reality that change is something that needs to be mediated. And the act of mediation is something that will have to take place, and not just by individuals, even though I believe strongly as a Renaissance historian in the actualized individual, but by those who can assist in the vocabulary of interpretation. And that's to some extent what I do. As a professor and as an academic and as an author, I try and use the language of interpretation to indicate that experience, images, texts, the news all mean something. But they don't mean something in terms of just what it is that you're seeing on the screen. They mean something in a broader context. And if I had to say what my essential job was, it's providing a universal context to information that otherwise would be orphan.
So, the reporter, journalist, and author, columnist Thomas Friedman has called himself a translator from English to English, right? But he also talks about mediation in some of his work, and you just mentioned mediation. What does this mean to mediate change?
When you think of the way scholarship or knowledge or even journalism had been practiced in the past, every newspaper, every magazine, every book had an editor, at least one, sometimes two. They were the ones who were able to take the raw material of the author's insight and put that in the context of the reader's experience of that insight. The complete freewheeling knowledge market of the internet does not allow for an editor. So the individual, him or herself, has to confront this and be his or her own editor. And the argument that I make is that not everybody has the skill set in order to do this well. One of the reasons I think there is this explosion of fake news, of conspiracy theories, and all the nonsense that one gets from social media is that there are those who do not have the skill set to actually make judgments about the information that's available and put them into a context where, from my perspective, they make sense. To believe something doesn't make it true. To want something to happen doesn't mean that it will. And unfortunately, if it is just a confrontation between an individual and a screen, that's very often the way that it is approached. How can I make this true? How can I make this happen? And this idea of mediation, then, is something that we have to take very seriously. The internet is never going to be regulated, I think, because it will be almost impossible. But what I have to do as an educator, and what I think society must do, is to ensure that those who use this instrument can function as their own editors. They can be their own mediators. They can put something in a broader context. They can actually fact check. They can make a judgment about something that seems to be implausible, might be true, but it needs to be checked.
Is the other side of this coin of mediation media literacy and being literate? I mean, if I'm looking at the internet and reading stories in the New York Times or the Guardian or Globe and Mail or The Conversation, which is a publication that takes academics and allows them to be readable by a larger audience, is it necessary for me to have some critical understanding in the same way that I have numeric literacy or numeracy, or if I'm climate change or climate literate, science literate? Is this an important distinction, or is that still up to the mediators to make sure that we're just getting the right information?
No, it's both. If you decide you want to go to Kingston and you buy a car, but you don't know how to drive, the car's not going to be of any use, and you're not going to be able to get there. So it's really the combination of the various factors that come into play in order to make what can be seen as valid observations and drawing valid conclusions. One of the curious anomalies of the explosion of technology in our own lifetime is that the Cartesian perspective of accept nothing is true until it has been proved to be true has somehow been jettisoned. So the very scientific method that Descartes largely began, that led us to the internet, is now creating a situation where this very method is undoing the principle that gave birth to it. So we need then a new set of ideas. We need a new set of instruments, vehicles to approach this so that we can still do what we have to do as rational creatures, and that is to draw valid conclusions, not assume that something is true simply because it appears on a screen, or something is true simply because you would like it to be true.
Right. I was gonna mention there was a cartoon in the New Yorker a few years ago, which is of a plane, a bunch of people in a plane, and one guy stands up and says, "Who says that this pilot sucks and that I should take over the plane?" Like the pilot doesn't know what he's doing, he's going too slow or whatever. And then I don't remember what other people respond to it, but the idea is this is populism in an image. As someone saying, "You're the experts and you don't know what you're talking about. Let me take over." Who would want that guy running the plane? Now, the same would go true maybe for those who are the mediators.
Well, exactly. It is, in fact, a danger. The only reality, I think, in the future is going to be that each one of us as individuals will have to be mediators. As I say, the internet is not going to be regulated. You are not going to control the flow of information. Each individual will have to make judgments, and we're going to have to start training them to do that. And again, one of the ironies is, since I mentioned Descartes and you mentioned the New Yorker, I had a New Yorker cartoon on my door for many, many years until a student stole it, which I consider an element of praise. And it was a scientist standing in front of this large computer whirring away, and it was reading the screen, and it said, "Cogito ergo sum." I think, therefore I am. Mm-hmm. And so it brings up that whole 2001 issue about, do we control the machines or do machines control us? And it is a legitimate danger. And if we ever yield that element of personal mediation and personal control over the information that passes through the machine, then in fact the machine will be able to control us. As to a degree, populism is showing the danger of the control of social media over individuals who simply are not making judgments about the information they're receiving.
Well, and this is an interesting point that takes us into history about the machine. Human beings, for most of our experience as a species, have been in contact with some kind of technology. And we've gone in lockstep with whether it's something as simple as bone tools and fire, to the Industrial Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution that came before that. And we've lived with technology throughout written history and even in prehistory. And yet it seems like something that is so new for us today. It seems like we are shifting our paradigms not only every day, but sometimes every hour as technology presents new ways of thinking about the world. And yet the machine, which sometimes dictates to us how we are to be, has been with us for a very long time. And so is there something fundamentally different about today? Or is this another notch in the long line of historical notches?
There is something fundamentally different. And if we look at the history of technology, and I'm anything but a technological determinist, we can see how machines and the application of technology changed the world, whether it was the introduction of the stirrup to the West that allowed for feudalism to develop, whether it was the heavy-wheeled plow that allowed for land to be cultivated that previously could not be, or the Industrial Revolution or anything. But there was always a context where, in fact, the technology was recognized and used because there was a general social need. We think of Hero of Alexandria. Hero in Hellenistic Egypt invented the steam engine. Now, what did he do with it? He made it into a toy. It was something that amused people. It did not start the Industrial Revolution. When James Watt perfected the steam engine in the middle of the 18th century, it changed civilization as we know it. Why? Because the context was different. There was a demand for goods. There was a growing group of people with sufficient disposable income to buy those goods. There was an international trade nexus that allowed for raw materials to be delivered and finished materials to be brought in their place. So it's that context that in the past has made that wonderful intersection between opportunity, technology, and need, and recognition that that need can be employed in order to make change. The difference now is that technology is everywhere, and society is simply no longer using technology to apply it to needs that either are identified or are socially or intellectually or economically or politically conditioned. They're using them because they're there. And this is a fundamental change because something exists. A, it doesn't mean that it's good. And B, it doesn't mean that it should be used for all purposes. And this again comes back to my point of the need for mediation. The need for individuals to be educated to make value judgments about the application of technology to society, to their own lives, or even to the assumptions that they make about how the universe operates. And one of the great fears I have about populism and current political events and the rise of social media conspiracy theories and so on is that these things truly do reflect I don't want to say uneducated, let's say an untutored mind applying complex technological instruments to try and solve a problem that doesn't exist.
Right.
And this is, I think, a great danger to society because it becomes socially disruptive. And we can see the glue that keeps society together beginning to soften and the fabric of society beginning to fray.
It's what humans do, right? We play with what's around us in the same way that a parrot, a really intelligent parrot like the Kia bird in New Zealand, will play with what's around it because that's how it exercises its mind. So if technology is there, we will play with it. And if the information is there, we will play with that and question that. One perhaps apocryphal story about this is when they built the iPhone, one of the versions finally came with a camera that faced you and not just faced out to take a picture with. It was not designed for selfies. They thought that this would be used for people to call their grandmother and see them face to face when they were, in Vietnam calling their grandmother in Peterborough, Ontario. And people didn't use it for that. They used it to take pictures of themselves, which is so funny. It's as if we are not parrots, but apes and monkeys who just see a thing and just, I'm going to take a picture of myself. And now that's all we do. That's what we've done with the technology that it's there. And I think that might come across as a silly point, but I think it's a deeper one about what human beings do and how we respond to technology when it is so overwhelming. We're not just going to lie over and pretend it isn't happening. We're going to make use of it. And whether it's dangerous or not, we're going to do something.
Absolutely. And there is a broader context to this. One of the things that interests me, and I've worked in a great deal, is the history of travel. And I ask my students, especially when I teach abroad in Italy, what it is that they saw that day when we're on a field trip. And what their response is exactly the same response that I get from even classically trained individuals in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. They saw what the guidebook told them they were seeing. They didn't actually have an experience that was unique and individual. They had their guidebook, or me, their professor, and they were instructed as to what it is they were seeing and its significance. This is normal and natural. In my study of guidebooks, what I've seen is that large numbers of them are simply plagiarized passages from earlier guidebooks, simply placed together. I've got examples of important objects that had been moved that appear twice in guidebooks, where they used to be and then where they are now. So what this indicates is that people experience what others tell them will be significant. You have your Michelin guide and said, okay, these are the 12 things worth a detour and these are the 4 things worth a visit. And those are the things you see. When you travel to Rome, you've got a list of things that your guidebook says you must see, and you see them, and often in the order in which the guidebook presents them. So are you having an individual experience? Is this really something that is changing you? Is travel changing your perception of the world, or is it simply providing evidence of your literacy? And the great danger now is that the information available on the internet and information that's technologically available generally does not have the very carefully considered mind and experience of the guidebook author behind it. So when you see something, as my students do, on the internet and reproduce it in an essay, I call them in and say, well, the problem is you've got a really nice description of the Church of the Gesù in Rome, but that's not the Gesù. I said, but I got it from the internet, and they'll show me the picture. Well, it is from somebody's vacation images, and that person had no idea what he was looking at. And he just knew that the Jesu was around there because the guidebook said it was, so it had to be the Jesu. Well, it wasn't. So this happens all the time with my students. The fact that they use technology as the mediating instrument. If it's on the technological instrument, it's true. Previously, and this is true, I think, from the moment we started inventing writing, if it appeared on a page, it was true. Remember, in the beginning was the word, the idea of the word being both sacred and essential. Well, those words were part of a social construction, part of a religious, political, intellectual, cultural environment that allowed you to interpret them in a way that made sense not just to you but to your community. Now with a complete, I don't want to say balkanization because it's more than that, complete fragmentation, individualization of experience because it's an individual staring into a screen, that sense of social cohesion, the context is lost. It is you alone. The anomic personality is being privileged by technology as opposed to being undone, which was the original hope, that we would all be connected, that democracy would flourish because our opinions would be known, that we'd be able to determine truth by everyone looking at Wikipedia and saying there's an error and they can correct that error.
Right.
That's not what's happening.
No, and I find this so interesting. On the one hand, because we're talking about how I react to the world around me with and without context. And it makes me ask, what does it mean to have an original thought? So if I'm going to Italy, again, with or without a guidebook, and I have an experience, say when I go to the Pantheon in Rome, and I have an experience of being in that room and what it means to me, that's still contextualized, even if I didn't bring a guidebook with me, because I grew up in a society in which learning I went to school for 12 years before I even went to university. There are things that are constructed and patterned into my mind. There are neural connections, if we're going to look at it from a scientific level, that affect my experience in that room. The guidebook is another level of context. And so we have to ask, what does it mean to have or to receive an original thought? And to get postmodern, is there no such thing as an original thought? But the other aspect that I really want to get to, and this relates actually to the Renaissance, is the growing individualism that we have seen in Western culture, well, for hundreds of years now, but it seems to be reaching some kind of an apex, and social media is a big part of this. So for a long time, we had one-to-one communication, and then with mass media, first of all, the printing press, which is another Renaissance era invention, or at least mobile type. And then, of course, we move into the last few centuries where the world has embraced the individual and put at the center at social life, to the point that today, I can have many-to-many communications. Many people are communicating with many people, and there's sometimes no intermediary in between them. I can have my language translated into another one instantaneously, so I can speak to somebody not only in Taiwan, but in a different language without having to know their language or for them to know mine. And again, I am at the center of that experience. And this I know is a generalization about the Renaissance, that it was the beginning of the enshrinement of the individual and of humanism. And I know that we're generalizing here, but to what extent was the Renaissance an era in which we changed our perspective of what the human was and what the human could be, and how the individual might be separate and distinct from the group?
It's central. It's really what I spend the first couple of weeks in my courses teaching. The Renaissance, to some extent, invented the modern concept of the individual. And it is a movement away, for reasons that we can discuss in a moment, but movement away from a much more medieval perspective, where people were actors in a play that God had written. We were following a script that was God's plan for man, and we should follow that script to the greatest of our ability, but our ability to riff on that script, to in fact improvise, would be severely limited, because A, would be seen as impertinent at the very least, and as blasphemous at the worst. So there was in fact a sense that the collective communal values represented by a universal church, in which the essential role of being human was to achieve salvation, was, as again to generalize, a kind of medieval social and cultural context in which people lived. But with the rise of a money economy, of long-distance trade, of self-governing communities in the Italian city-state, the idea of social mobility, which all of these things presuppose and permit, this idea began to fray. So individuals began to say, wait a minute, I actually can determine to a large degree my own life on earth. And I need help to get through the difficult moral questions of the day beyond the injunctions of a universal church. So if you're a banker in Florence and the church says taking money at interest will take you to hell, you've got a serious problem. But if you say, I'm an individual, by taking money at interest, I can rise socially, my daughters can make better marriages, my sons can rise in the Republican government, then what I'm doing is actually good for society, and the surplus wealth that I'm making will pay taxes, will build city walls for protection, will build great cathedrals, and will provide art and culture. The opposite of this, the idea that you are somehow challenging God, can easily be broken. And I think the revolution really begins with Petrarch, when he thought, the ancients were pagans, but they have terrific moral compass. They have wonderful advice about getting through the dark night of the soul, and they can really help us. So what I'm going to think then is that there is a division. What happens on earth has an implication for heaven, but essentially it has a greater implication for the human community in which I live, and I can contribute to that. It's not going to aid my salvation. That I will leave to the church, but I can do something on earth. So the recovery of antiquity, especially pagan antiquity, allowed for individuals then to make individual decisions based upon their personal needs and the needs of the community. And that really begins to drive an entire civilization to try and understand what it was to be human. And it leads to linear perspective by allowing a new vocabulary to develop so that you can see what I'm seeing, because I can reproduce it in a rational way on make a three-dimensional scene on a two-dimensional surface. It's true in correct anatomy. I know what you look like, and this matters because you're an individual. And I don't want to think of you in the abstract terms of Christian or bishop or priest, but as Ben. And this takes on a significance as well. And then I think finally, the element that becomes most important is the recognition that human beings theologically have souls. We're the only animals that have souls. We're the only animals capable of redemption. And there is this pact with God. This is a Christian perspective. It's a medieval perspective. It's all fine. And it's a Renaissance perspective. But the addition is, what else do human beings have? They have reason. Your dog can't reason. And you have speech. Your dog can't talk. So there must be a connection between speech, reason, and speech as the externalization of reason, and the soul. So by learning to speak well, by communicating with the community, by aiding and benefiting the community, through your speech, through your education, and through your reason, by offering alternatives, which leads to not only social mobility, but social change, you break out of that box of a world that was created and is meant to be fulfilled rather than one that is meant to change and develop. So that's what I think happened.
There's so many things in your answer that I want to pick out, but there's one thing first, and talking again in general about the Renaissance, Renaissance meaning rebirth, the French word for rebirth. And it was the recovery, as you said, of antiquity, Greek and Roman and pagan antiquity. And I think that there's this conception about the Renaissance that it was bringing those old ideas back to the forefront, which is true to some extent. But does that mean that this idea of the human being, the individual being at the center of our discourse, that the rational, reasonable, soulful individual who is not necessarily just an actor in a predetermined play, and who is also not just going around and around on the wheel of fortune, but is something to be in a way sacred unto him or herself. Is that an old idea, or was that a new idea that was synthesized from the old ones?
I think it was a reborn idea. I think in antiquity, individuals were given a certain degree of recognition simply because those that survived from antiquity were authors, were philosophers, were those who could be recognized and their individual contribution could be then applied. But the thing about the Renaissance, it wasn't antiquarianism, and this is the important point. It's just not recovering the past and then worshiping and saying, God, those guys were smart. Isn't this cool? Rather, it is the application of these ideas, these principles, these vehicles, this vocabulary to the needs of the society of Italy in the late 14th and 15th century. These are tools, and the tool is to create a different kind of society, to benefit humanity through the application of your own learning, through your own experience, through your own wisdom, and really through your own ability to identify what is good and avoid what is evil. And that requires speech and it requires ethical behavior. So it is the recovery, to be sure, but it's a recovery not of something that was dead and is worshipped as something that is beautiful but gone, but something that is living and something that is just as applicable to the world of Republican Florence as it is to the world of Republican or early Imperial Rome.
Something that Ken said that struck me was that people experience what other people tell them will be significant. This is true in travel, it's true in education, it's true in work, it seems to be true everywhere. Now, coming up in this conversation, we continue on this theme of the individual. And what does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to be a human being in the world, not just today, but any day? The concept of Renaissance self-fashioning, the ability to make yourself into who you will be by your decisions and your actions and your thinking now is really, really critical. And it relates back to this idea that we experience what other people tell us will be significant. Can we experience what we tell ourselves will be significant? I think this is a really key point, not only to the Renaissance, but into what on earth is going on today. This is something that I learned when I myself traveled to Italy and to Europe, and one fascination I have, which is architecture, which was central to the Renaissance. And, I thought that the Renaissance was, of course, the recovery of antiquity. And then from then on, we built classical buildings, again, neoclassicism and all of this stuff. But then I learned that there were movements before the Renaissance that were inspired by Greek and Roman architecture and Greek and Roman ideas. Romanesque architecture is not Renaissance architecture. It predates it. And what I realized is that it's not like the Greek and Romans went away throughout the Dark Ages. It's that Italians specifically, and then of course other cultures after the Germans, the English, the French, whatever, were able to change their perspective of that past based on new information that came through the Muslim world, for example, and change their ability to see, and again through new technology as well, the ability to paint vanishing point for one thing, to see those pasts in a different way, and therefore to see the future in a different way. And one other point I wanted to bring up, because the Renaissance is obviously often associated with Italy, but obviously the English Renaissance occurred for many historians a little bit later, especially during the time of Shakespeare. And the theater critic Harold Bloom famously said that Shakespeare was responsible for inventing the human. And it was actually in Hamlet's monologues. And that in any monologue, any soliloquy in a Shakespeare play, where a character speaks to himself and to the audience, and in the course of doing so, changes his mind. And that was something that had never happened before. I don't know if that's true, if that had never happened before, but the idea that a person by themselves, without a force from God, without a force from another individual, or even a book, could, in the course of their own conversation unto themselves, change their mind about something and decide to take a different action. To be or not to be, I will choose to be because I just thought about it to myself. I didn't wait for, the deus ex machina to tell me what to do.
Yeah, because otherwise you're just the quintessence of dust.
Yes.
The statement that this is something created at the time of Shakespeare, I don't agree with. I think it's actually much older. And the issue of the soliloquy, when Hamlet is talking to himself, or any Shakespearean character is talking to himself, he's talking to the audience.
That's right, yes.
And there is then a dialogue, and that dialogue is significant in its own sense. The nature and the relationship of that dialogue, though, can take several forms. For example, the relationship of an individual as a reader to a text. And we see this, I think, most perfectly fulfilled in Montaigne, that by reading the early essays of Montaigne really are a response to his reading. But you watch in those early essays, he changes as a consequence of what he is reading. And then when you get to the very late essays, you see how the changed personality, the changed individual, can then address all kinds of circumstances, all kinds of images, simply because he now has another skill set. And that skill set is perfected and polished as a consequence of his having read. So I think that reading is an element of soliloquy, just the same way as a character on a stage in dialogue with the audience, a silent dialogue. Like when I tell my students, it's really trendy now in university educational offices to say the lecture is dead, that students don't have any interest in being passive. Well, then they're experiencing a bad lecture, because any lecture is in fact a silent dialogue, and the person listening should be an active response to what is being said by the professor on the stage. And it is an element of theater, but it's really an element of self-creation. And this is it. When the concept of Renaissance self-fashioning developed, which is very popular, of course, after Stephen Greenblatt's book, it really did define what I mean when I talk about the creation of the individual. It is the whole concept of being able to make yourself what you choose to be. In other words, you are continually a piece of raw material, and that raw material is always being perfected. You are a masterpiece of your own artistic genius, and it should change. You look in the mirror every morning and you make a decision. Who am I today? Am I Cesare Borgia, or am I San Bernardino of Siena? I mean, who am I? And that will determine how you dress, how you act, the company you keep. And you can be many things. And the thing about the Renaissance individual is that it's not a singular phenomenon. When you go to a party it's in an abandoned factory and it's an all-night rave, and you put on your spandex jumpsuit and you behave in a particular way.
You're speaking from experience, obviously.
Clearly, you should see the photos. You're one person. But then when you have dinner with your grandparents on Sunday night, you dress differently, you act differently, you become a completely different person. But does that mean that you really have a kind of schizophrenia? No, you're the same person, actualizing different elements and privileging different elements of your own experience and knowledge and self. And that is the great gift of the Renaissance. The invention of the individual, but the individual as a malleable form, something that can change, that is almost an act of creation. The final assignment for my students in the Renaissance Culture course is they have to turn their lives into works of art. And it's a long-term assignment, and it lasts the rest of their life on Earth, but they have to keep checking in. How, in fact, am I taking my experience, my reading, my job, my friends, my family, and how is it changing me? Because that is the Renaissance gift, the ability to change yourself through interaction with others and experience, through the externalization of your experience to benefit others, and then collectively to create a better community.
Is that what it means to be a Renaissance man or a Renaissance woman, in a sense, to incorporate all of this learning and make it into something? Absolutely,
because a human being is a mosaic, and we keep adding tesserae to allow the image to either become clearer, to be broader, to be more dramatic, to reflect the light differently. And every tessera is an element of experience. It's a book that you've read. It's a person that you've met. It's a place that you've seen. So every individual is, in fact, self-fashioned and self-created. And that's why, to go back to our earlier conversation, why I think good information is so critical. Because if you're going to change yourself based upon experience, then you have to be able to interpret that experience in a way that is positive, that is useful, and according to a judgment that has got some measure of validity. You don't want to use the wrong color tessera, because then the whole image begins to become imperfect. So self-creation, the individual, the dynamic individual, the individual not just obsessed with him or herself, but obsessed with him or herself in relation to the community in which he or she lives, and the contributions to be made as well as the benefits to be accepted. This is what we're talking about.
Right, and this is a really interesting point. You mentioned being obsessed with yourself, right? And this is something that it's hard not to look away from in the modern world. This incessant narcissism and self-obsession to the point, and I don't mean to bring him into the conversation, we won't, but Donald Trump seems to be the apex of self-obsession taking over, because it's exactly the reflection of what we seem to have become in many ways. Now, the Renaissance is often seen these days as the continuation of the medieval era, as the continuation of the Middle Ages. But to the same token, we could say that the modern era is a continuation of the Renaissance. Have we become more and more self-obsessed along this line, and will we continue to do so? Or is something out of equilibrium in the world today with this? I think it's self-evident that we are a much more narcissistic people.
We've lost part of the other part of the equation that I talked about, and that is the application of the individual and the growth of the individual to the community. You're a narcissist if you only see the first part of the equation. That is the growth of self, who I am, why I matter, what I've done. The other part of the equation is, does this matter? How can I use it? How can I benefit others? How can I engage with my society so that I grow in a way that allows me to be integrated in that society, but at the same time contribute to it, and then allows society to benefit me by speaking in a language and in a vocabulary that would permit my growth to work in tandem and parallel with this social development. The problem with the narcissists like Donald Trump is that they only see themselves. The world is a mirror, and to a true Renaissance humanist, the world is a window. It's a glass, and you look out and see others, and you are curious about them. So you develop everything, as I've suggested, from correct physiognomy to vanishing point perspective to different forms of literature in order to provide a mechanism to share experience. Trump doesn't share experience, he dictates experience. And his frame of reference is that of personal gain and personal interest. You can't get farther from a true Renaissance individual than that. It is exactly what you should not do.
Are we in the midst of a transformation, perhaps not unlike the Renaissance today? And when we look at the Renaissance, we're talking about the influence of antiquity, but also of technology. There was a critical mass in trade, not only Italy, but Europe being a nexus of global trade. And of course, it was enhanced by the, quote unquote, discovery of the New World in 1492. There were all these things at play that allowed this revolution, this transformation to take place in the same way that the Enlightenment took place in the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution in the 19th. Are we seeing similar forces at play? And I understand this is asking us to bring out the crystal ball, but are we seeing similar forces at play now? Or are things so accelerated that it's spinning onto a different paradigm altogether?
Historical development is to a degree linear, not equally, but it is a series of cause and effect. If the Renaissance hadn't actualized the individual and gave validity to individual experience, you couldn't have the scientific revolution. Because if you look at something happening in nature and you do not accept the validity of your own experience of that, and the ability to assume that what you're seeing is correct, and then also develop the correct instruments so that you can put it out to others to test your assumptions, you are not going to have scientific revolution. So in fact, there is a direct connection from one to the other. The problem now is at that point there were certain shared values that were in many ways challenged. I mean, we know what Galileo came up against, but there also was the assumption that the direction that Galileo was going may have challenged those who simply wanted to accept the truths of church and scripture. But those who accepted Galileo also accepted the fact that he was using correct scientific method and reaching valid conclusions. What's happening now is that there is the same kind of challenge. Donald Trump challenging any report that he doesn't agree with as fake news, and all sorts of parallels. But those that are supporting him aren't working the way the scientific revolutionaries of the 17th century supported Galileo. They're supporting him because of an act of faith. They believe him and they want what he says to be true. I think in some ways we're going back to almost a medieval perspective, where what matters is when the prophet speaks, you accept it, and you accept it as true, even if it's contrary to your own rational processes and the evidence before you. The acceptance of some of the things that populists of all kinds say is truly terrifying to a rational mind. But there are millions of people who accept it. Why? Because they believe in the person who said them. In the Renaissance, people challenged Galileo. They didn't say, Galileo said it, so it's got to be true. They said, well, what Galileo is saying is really interesting. I better test this. And Galileo accepted that and made sure that he put his assumptions out in print so that other people could test and see if, in fact, he was right. The populists don't do that.
It sounds like we're talking about power here, too. I mean, what you're saying with the medieval perspective is that if the divine messenger said so, then it must be true. We accept that as where power comes from, and the church itself has immense temporal power, not just spiritual power. And that seems to break down a little bit in the Renaissance, where we treat evidence, and then, of course, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and so forth, where evidence is privileged above all else. And, of course, in our societies today, where we privilege the rule of law above all else, that nobody, including any president or autocrat anywhere, is above the rule of law. And that seems to be fraying a little bit as power, if quote unquote, seems to be reasserting itself. But I guess it brings the question, has there ever been a time when power was truly subservient to the rule of law or to evidence and reason, whether it was in the Renaissance or later or before, or has power always had its own privilege?
Yeah. Power, like water, always seeks its own level, Ben. And if it has the opportunity to exercise power above or outside the law, it will. If it is constrained, then there is tension, but it's not necessarily a sure thing that this power will be exercised. The whole idea of power, though, has two elements. One is there's power of office or power of birth or power of wealth and all of those sorts of things. And then there's the power that other people ascribe to other individuals. So why on what basis should somebody accept a populist decision, let's say again like Donald Trump? Because he's president of the United States or because he's Donald Trump? And what I think future historians will find is that his faithful, his base, accept what he says and does because he's Donald Trump. The office of president is to some extent immaterial. It just is proof to them that what he's saying must be true because he has this high office. The danger then is that the populist, the outlying individual, the narcissist who is armed with his own truth, will be given a position of power by those who choose to believe him. Now, this leads to the second question. Why would they? Why do they choose to believe somebody who clearly is morally bankrupt, who is a liar, and all of the other things that's so clear from the evidence? I think it goes back to our question of the individual again. Individualism presupposes a measure of not only self-knowledge, but a recognition of dignity and self-worth. I think there are lots of people who see their self-worth and their dignity challenged. They're unemployed, they're poorer than other people, they've got poor educations, they have difficulty functioning in a society. And the negative element of extreme individualism is, do they blame themselves? No, they blame the exterior forces. And any populist becomes the spokesman and the identifier of those forces that cause you personal embarrassment and that seem to challenge your dignity. So identifying with Donald Trump gives them some dignity, gives them some power that they don't otherwise have, gives them some authority, and is some kind of comfort to their ego. Why? Because there are millions of them. I'm not alone. Because what he says, whether he does it or not, is comforting. I'm going to bring back jobs that in manufacturing. All of these are, I'm going to keep out people who are going to rob and rape you. Right. This is irrelevant. It's irrational and it's not true. But if you're in a position where your individuality, where your sense of self has been so worn down by circumstance, it becomes an element of hope.
Well, and there's another aspect to this with what you were just saying, that when a populist leader, whether it's Donald Trump or Viktor Orban in Hungary or wherever we want to look, they're appealing to my basic tribal desires to have an us versus them mentality. They want to have an out group, whether it's the elites or the immigrants or the elites in league with the immigrants to take over our society. And of course, they had a black man elected as president, and how awful is that? And this whole conundrum is created where my only solution is to have someone who is worse than them to finally restore my dignity, as you said. But there's another aspect too, which is that there's something for Donald Trump supporters and for other populists elsewhere where it just seems efficacious to do so. So there are many in the right-wing conservative Christian base in the United States who think Donald Trump is awful because he's an clearly amoral, if not immoral man. But he's going to protect my rights, and he's going to get rid of abortion in the United States. And he's going to make Supreme Court judges who will eventually overturn Roe versus Wade. There are a lot of people down there who just simply on that one node of efficaciousness support Donald Trump, and it overwhelms all other considerations. And I can't think, to go back to the Renaissance, of anything else that is more anti-Renaissance, because it is so singular in focus. It is not taking in the wide breadth and scope of the human condition. It is one single issue that is motivating someone. And it's a deal with the devil as well. I'll trade away everything else in order to get my one thing that I seem to want so badly.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and the number of Trump's base, those who are evangelical Christians, accept Trump as God's instrument. Many of them have said, God gave us Donald Trump. God arranged for this improbable election to happen because he has a plan. And that plan simply corresponds to the plan of the evangelical Christians. And everything from the movement of the capital to Jerusalem, the embassy to Jerusalem in Israel, is the coming of Armageddon. It's coming to the fulfillment of the Lord's intention. Well, the problem with any scriptural text is that it can be interpreted in any number of ways. And in terms of the American religious right, it is Christian in vocabulary and Christian in thought and reference, but essentially it's an extreme social conservatism that goes beyond religion. The reason they hate abortion, the reason that they hate same-sex marriage, is not that it's against the Word of God. They don't like it. They see it as morally reprehensible, that it is not the way they do things. So it becomes a perfect storm for liberals, because liberals on the one hand say, well, freedom of religion, freedom of thought, believe what you want, I don't care what you believe, that's perfectly fine. But then when it comes against a set of principles that would destroy liberalism, then you've got to make some difficult decisions. Is it right to, it's not really yelling fire in a crowded theater, it's much more like Lenin saying that I will create a state in which another revolution is impossible. And that is much more, I think, what the Christian right is looking at. They're looking at the creation of a society where social change is not going to happen, even at the expense of legitimacy in government, the rule of law, a moral order to which they subscribe. All of these things become secondary, as you said.
So there's another aspect, I think, of modernity which is happening at the same time as all of this, but it seems to be either on the other side of the coin or another perspective of it, but it's this questioning of everything. And I'm sure that you as a professor, as a member of the academy, have experienced this, or at least seen it happen, where those in positions of power, whether they're intellectual or government or whatever, are held to more and more question, and that it doesn't mean anything anymore for you to be a professor because you're just an elitist, that kind of thing. And it even goes into studies of the Renaissance. It's something I was looking into in preparation for this conversation, that there's there's a general theory now that the Renaissance is used as a justification of empire, imperialism, even up to the 21st century. That, Western nations are great because they enshrine the rights of the individual and private property that comes with that, and they really just allow colonialism and post-colonialism to perpetuate itself. I'm not saying that that's necessarily wrong. It just is another part of this constant questioning of everything, so that we live in this uncertain plasma where nothing is certain and I can't hang my coat on any hook. I guess, first of all, like, have you experienced that? What do you think of it? And where do you think that's going?
Sure, of course, we all experience it all the time. And we used to, interestingly enough, experience it far more than we do now. And I'll tell you why. 30 or 40 years ago, before everybody had access to information they believed to be true and to reinforce their own prejudice, there was challenging of authority. Students saying, how can you say that? How can you say that the concept of the individual is good, given that individualism gave rise to all of the sins that they're quite willing to enumerate? And that is a discussion I'm delighted to have. It is a discussion that indicates that the student is engaging with the material and has got some evidence to work from and is seriously concerned with an open dialogue where, even if we choose to disagree, the dialogue itself is an important occasion. What I'm finding increasingly is a student who challenges what I say or the books that they read, and I ask them on what basis. They say, because I don't agree.
And that's it.
That's it.
Right.
And I say, well, who are you? And they said, well, you're just challenging my ideas, and you're just not accepting my ideas as equal to yours. I said, well, I don't care what you believe. I don't care what your idea is, but this is an intellectual institution. You've got to prove that idea. You've got to have some measure of evidence. You have to indicate to a broader audience that your conclusion has some validity. Why? I live in my own solipsistic universe. What I think, what I believe, is all that matters to me. And this is the great danger, and it's happening more and more, that students have no frame of reference. They're given a very shallow education in large numbers of fields so that they can't really have any depth. And they just are encouraged to reach. It has to do with, again, it's not the validation of the individual, it's the recognition that all ideas and all individuals are equal. Well, not all ideas are equal. And there is, I'm sad to say, not an equality of intelligence or experience or knowledge amongst individuals either. So to simply say, I believe it, therefore it is true, is to challenge not just the Renaissance and the concepts of rationalism, but I think the very foundation of what constitutes modern society, whether it's government, whether it's the economy, whether it's culture, whatever. But it happens more and more. And I think partly it has to do with the way the educational system is structured now, where no one fails, there is no serious challenge to ideas, regardless how foolish, and all ideas are equal, and you get a B just for having written one, whether it has any validity or not. And that then is translated into a university environment where we are encouraging our students to challenge everything and to be open-minded, where they only get half of it. They challenge everything, but they're closed-minded.
So to go back to what we were talking about closer to the beginning of the conversation, do you think that this outcome that we're seeing, that you just described, is also partly the result of technology, social media, and having this sort of memory prosthetic that's attached to us, that I don't have to remember anything or know anything anymore. I can just look it up when I need to. And therefore, by not having this gray matter between the ears filled with anything, I'm therefore threatened by anyone that asks me for evidence, and therefore I can just say, "Well, I don't believe you're right." Do you think that that's a fit?
There is absolutely no question. When I get students, or what frightens me more, teachers, who say that, well, students don't have to memorize anything anymore. They don't have to read long passages because if there's something they need to know, they can simply find it and look it up. Well, my question to them is, how do they know what question to ask? That is the fundamental issue. They don't know what questions to ask. The other is the reliance on technology and the internet. Well, the most absurd opinion, the most outrageous conclusion is never unique. there are always others who have versions of that or who share it, and you can find them on the internet.
And it's going back to that original idea that we were talking about.
And so we go to a different kind of tribalism. So it's not tribalism of place and people and race. It's a tribalism of irrational belief. And this is what we see on the internet constantly, is irrational belief that's reinforced by numbers. And if you look at the chats at the bottom of news articles, and some newspapers have actually stopped doing them, you see that there is not discussion of the article. There is a rant against the article. And is the rant based on evidence of any kind? No, it's based on the fact that I don't like you, I don't like it, I don't like the idea, and so I'm going to shut it down.
So my last question to you, Ken, I mean, living as we do now and learning as we can from the Renaissance and from history in general, what do we do? What do we do at this juncture? What can we do? Is this something where we let time heal, where we have a faith in the future that progress will undo the harms and bring us to an equilibrium? Or do we need to be a bit more proactive?
Well, progress is a myth, and it's always hindsight. We are progressing because we're where we are now, and that doesn't follow either logically or historically. What we need to do is recognize where we are now and treat it with the concern that I think many of us feel. It's not regulating the internet, because A, it's impossible, and B, I don't think it's even necessarily a very good thing. It's not simply rejecting those who come up with crazy conspiracy theories because they can find friends who also believe that on the internet. I think it has to do with the way that we educate people. We have to make it absolutely clear that they have got to make rational, reasonable decisions based on evidence. And we have to start it in kindergarten. You cannot simply believe something because you choose to believe it. As I tell my students when they give me this argument, and many of them argue from religion or from the tyranny of the dinner table, I say, okay, I believe God is a green gerbil living in Detroit. Prove me wrong. And they stare at me, say, what's the difference from what you just said to me? And they said, well, it's because I believe they either cite scripture or they experience or some kind of national prejudice. And I say, it falls into exactly the same category. I have no evidence and I just choose to believe it. You have no evidence and you have chosen to believe it. Until we can have a rational discussion based upon some kind of mediation that is founded on evidence, and I don't want to use the word fact, but certainly on evidence, then the conversation will be pointless. We will simply talk over one another. And I think maybe because I'm an educator, the response is education, and we have to start early. We have to try and go back to, if not scientific method, at least the recognition that all ideas are not equal, that there is a hierarchy of truth, and we need to learn how to navigate that hierarchy so that we can reach conclusions that are not only valid, but are mutually beneficial in a broadly based society.
Well, I'm just thinking as you say that if all ideas are not equal, I think some people, especially if we have a tribalism of idea as opposed to a tribalism of place or ethnicity, if the tribalism is one of idea, then if you say that there is an inequality of ideas, then you must also be saying there's an inequality of people. And maybe that deep down is the threat to somebody who is told that prove it is actually a way of saying prove that you're an equal human being. And to anybody who, as you have studied the Renaissance, that's absurd. The fact of being human is self-evident. Yeah.
And what is the essence of human? And I really like to see a human being defined as a rational animal. We are animals, live in a pack, and Aristotle was right, we're social animals. But at the same time, we are the unique example of a species that is rational. And so we have a responsibility to not only confirm and to celebrate that reason, but also to celebrate the speech that externalizes and shares that reason. And that, I hope, will help bring about not only a more egalitarian society, but a society that's much more open and much more dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Ken, this has been a really wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
It's been my pleasure, Ben, and I sincerely hope our audience liked it as well.
I hope so too. They'll let us know, I'm sure. Thanks again. To learn more about Ken Bartlett, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all other episodes and ways to get in touch with me to give me your feedback on this episode or any other, or to give me your suggestions for future guests or future topics to be discussed. Now, your quote of the week is fitting, I think, given this conversation with Ken, and given that the author of it is Leonardo da Vinci, the Renaissance man himself. Quote, "Learning never exhausts the mind." Thanks, as always, to our composer Andrea Wetstein, and special thanks this week to Ken Bartlett for giving us the space to record at the University of Toronto. Next week's conversation is about Alberta politics with Janet Brown, Denise Brunsden, and Anthony Sayers. I'll see you then.